Welcome and good evening to this evening's talk, which is part of our 2018 My Journey with Tony speaker series. And I'm very excited that Winslow Briggs is speaking about his encounters with an artist explorer, which is Tony Foster. And we have a special surprise because instead of me giving you a longer introduction, we have Tony Foster himself who is going to introduce Winslow tonight. So please help me welcome Tony.
Thanks, Corinne. Actually, I'm only here really as Winslow's warm-up man, that's all. So in order to warm you up, I'm going to tell you one anecdote about one of the many trips that Winslow and I did together. In 1989, Winslow and his daughter Lucia, who's here this evening, and I went to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I wanted to work at a place called Cape Final, which is in the backcountry, way out in a remote spot on the north rim. Well, in order to do that, you have to get a permit, and you have to go to the backcountry permit office and meet the backcountry ranger and be given the lecture about don't forget to take water, wear sensible shoes, don't forget your hat, all those things. Now, all three of us had heard this lecture quite a lot of times before, and I thought in order to curtail it, or to slow it down, or to shut it up a bit, I said to the backcountry ranger, I said, "Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but do you realize who you're talking to?" And he said, "No." And I said, "This is Professor Winslow Briggs." And he looked a bit blank, and I said, "This is the inventor of the patent bodily fluid recycling system." I said, it works like a wetsuit, only the other way around. I said, he walked all the entire length of the Atacama Desert, carrying only 1 quart of water. And at the beginning he had a quart, at the end he still had a pint left. And the ranger looked at me with complete astonishment and luckily issued the permit, and off we went. So I just tell you this anecdote because I told this story to the ranger, and there's about as much truth in the story I told the ranger as there's going to be in Winslow's talk tonight. So I got nothing more to say except to introduce you to my very good friend and traveling companion, Winslow Briggs.
Well, Tony and I have been exchanging insults for 32 years, and I don't expect it to stop soon. It's a real delight to be part of this lecture series at the Foster, and I'm thrilled to be surrounded by these magnificent paintings, and this guy is incredibly gifted. And now, I don't want that to go to his head. Well, maybe it's too late. But I'm sure he'll be given a chance to rebut afterwards. And that's okay. He'll have to get permission from the authorities to do that. But what I hope is that all of you will have had sufficient wine that it just won't make any difference. Okay, well, encounters with an artist explorer. I would have put down travels or journeys with an artist explorer, except that the most important encounters, I think, in the time that we've known him, was that very first year in 1986, 32 years ago, when we decided that we were going to do the John Muir Trail. Okay, so we're going to start out talking about John Muir's High Sierra and the John Muir Trail. Then we're going to move on to the Grand Canyon. And then part of the arid lands was the trip to Joshua Tree. And then finally, something about Denali, and I'll explain that when I get there. So the initial encounter was on the north end of the John Muir Trail. A few statistics. Here we are. We had a stock animal. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyhow, some statistics on that. 211 miles, 851 switchbacks up, 520 down. Total climbing, 42,850 feet. And trail descending, just a little bit less because you come out a little bit higher than you started. I don't know whether Tony knew he was getting into that or not. So in any case, this is the profile of the first 60 miles. I marked Nevada Falls because that was the scene of a very important incident with Tony. Here he is. They had a mule. This is one of Parker Huber's photographs. Parker was his very strong guide and friend. And so they had a mule, and there's Nevada Falls. Well, Marion and I got as far as just above Nevada Falls through some complicated logistics that I won't bore you with. Marion and I were going to do that first stretch, and Ann would wait up at Tuolumne Meadows because the llama wasn't allowed on that first part in Yosemite Park. So anyhow, we went on further about 3 hours after this camp, and we came on these two characters sitting by the side of the trail, looking pretty morose. And one of them was Parker, and he was quite chatty, but the other one was just not saying very much and seemed to be totally disinterested. And I thought, oh well, this guy's just a shy introvert. And boy, did I learn that wrong. Well, they got as far as the falls with the donkey, and the donkey wouldn't cross under any circumstances. So somebody there were a lot of folks, said, well, all right, let's took off his packs, and maybe you can push him across and then reload him. So they took off his packs, whereupon the donkey said, wow, and took off. never to be seen again. So that was one of the reasons that they did look a bit odd. Parker was lugging a 2-gallon can of white gas. Tony, of course, had this weird cylindrical tube on his pack, and it didn't make much sense. But then looking, as I went over that bridge at the top of the falls, I took pictures. And if it scared the blazes out of me, I'm not surprised that it scared the donkey. Okay, up over Cathedral Peak, many of you will know that. And what happened is we continued on and stopped for lunch, and then Tony and Parker came struggling past us with their heavy packs, and asked how much further they might find water. And I said, there's a spring, a nice creek about half a mile up. So we went on there, and they went on. We passed them, and boy, Tony was totally changed. He was sitting there, his stove was humming, and it turns out that Tony has to have tea. He's totally addicted. He has to have tea every 2 hours, all the time. And he had his tea. He was cheerful, yappity, yappity, yappity. And so we invited them to come over and join us. They were going to spend the night at Tuolumne Meadows, which they did. We had a lovely, lovely evening with them and a nice campfire. Okay, so we went our separate ways. Tony stayed to paint, and we took off, headed towards the Devil's Post Pile. And this is on our way up. Just to show you that Marion was a free spirit. And here she is leading the llama. And I had to show me leading the llama only because I wanted you to see that I'm carrying an ice axe. And the ice axe will figure it a little bit, but we'll get to that. See, there's a good use for an ice axe. Why not? Well, we came around the corner, and here were the minarets and Ritter and Banner, and we're now only about 6 miles from the post pile. And who should we run into but Tony, busily painting. And how the blazes did he get around us? He was making a painting. We'll see more of these cases, but this is what his view of Banner and Ritter. Now, we could accuse him of copying my photographs, but he didn't know anything about them. He really did it right there. And another picture of Mandarin River again, and then one looking in the opposite direction towards Agnew Peak. So how did they get ahead of us? Well, what happened is that they spent too much time painting in Yosemite and suddenly realized that they weren't going to get back to make their plane back to Cornwall if they didn't scoot out and come around and come in further south. So they did that, and that's... So again, we had a nice little reunion and then continued on, and thought, well, that's great. We learned somewhere along here that they were going to do the whole John Muir Trail. They were going to try to put a show together. Tony was going to try to put a show together. So we wished him well and went on to the next stretch, and we're now headed towards Evolution Creek and eventually to Little Peat Meadow. Some of you may have been there. I've highlighted 3 places. One of them is Evolution Basin, where Evolution Lake. Some of you may have seen Evolution Lake if you've done that. It's a spectacular place. I was absolutely stunned. I first saw his paintings from that journey only about 2 weeks ago, and I was stunned to find out that this is his painting. It's almost, we must have sat in the same place, or very, very close to it. It was astonishing. Well, over Muir Pass, the first of the big great passes, we came upon this. It had been a horrendous winter, and you can see that what must have happened here is that the snow level was all the way up to that top, and an avalanche came down, and it was just like a razor blade, sheared off all of the, it actually dumped him in the creek. It was an appalling mess. Okay, so we made camp. Oh, yeah, another use of the ice axe. So this is Marion fishing. Fishing becomes important a little later on. And she got four very nice little trout. And this is Huck Finn cooking. Well, while we were there at a little meadow, there are these magnificent junipers that Tony painted. There are a couple of them not far from where we were camped. Here's another one. They're just marvelous, marvelous old trees, and he certainly captured them. Well, the next pass of these are the great passes. There are 4 of them in a row, 5 of them in a row before you get to Whitney. And Mather is the second, Muir was the first, and this is just looking south from Mather Pass. Well, guess what? There's looking south from Mather Pass. I mean, it was uncanny to keep stumbling on these. Well, here we are, further along, crossing Woods Creek, a rather nasty crossing. Bless Marion for handling the animal. And they got ahead of us again. My God, here they are at the Ray Lakes. And that picture of Parker's has them greeting us. Well, that's a spectacular place. Marion went fishing there. And she caught 4 fish again, and that was fine. And the 3 of us ate 3 of them. And then she said, you know, Parker is a vegetarian, and so they haven't had any meat or anything. I wonder whether Tony would like this. So she took it over to their camp, and Tony said, wow. And that was that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And about an hour later, he appeared at our camp and said, Marion, I should have painted that fish. Would you get me another? And in fact, she got up at 5:30 the next morning, got him another fish. He painted it, and I'm sure he ate it. Well, why aren't we? Yeah. So this is Painted Lady, and it's a perfectly beautiful spot. This is at the Ray Lakes. So Tony was painting it. Here is Tony with this easel, and there is a Painted Lady up at the top. And here's what he was painting. Again, it was astonishing. And I don't know whether you can read it here, but you can look at the original here, because right at this point it says, thanks, Marion. So we left, and that was the last we saw of them. But before we left, I got up my nerve to ask whether we could see what he was painting. And because we hadn't seen anything that he was doing, it was just always, you didn't want to interrupt him. So he rather reluctantly pulled it out. And I don't blame him for not wanting to show an incomplete painting. But it was very, very obvious that this guy had an extraordinary gift. So then it turned out that he was going to go to Los Angeles and look for a gallery. Well, and then if he didn't find one there, they would take his Muir Trail pictures and be his agent. He'd come up to San Francisco. So we said, Tony, why don't you, if you give us a call if you don't have success in Los Angeles, and you can come and stay with us, and then you can go to, you can commute to San Francisco and stay as long as you need to. So he did, and we parted, and essentially that was the end of our part. This is now from Glen Pass, looking down at the little pocket lakes that are above the Ray Lakes, and that's a little thief. And here we are at the end of the Muir Trail. Well, okay, there's an interlude here. A couple of weeks later, the phone rang, and it was Tony, and he said, I'm not having much luck here. Can I really take you up on that? And we said, sure. So he came and stayed with us, and he went to San Francisco each day, and he would come back tired and glum, until one day he came back and said, I've got a gallery. And a man named Peter Fairbanks, who is somewhere in the audience, I think, who owns the Montgomery Gallery, agreed to take Tony as his only living artist. He had up to that time never dealt with anything except dead artists. So he was willing to take a chance. And are we ever glad he did? Well, that wasn't the end of it, because my wife Anne read in the San Francisco paper that the California Academy of Sciences was having a contest, a competition for painters who did paintings of California landscapes. It was one day, I believe, before the deadline. So she told Tony, and he went tearing up and came back, and boy, what a changed person he was, because he aced out everybody and won the competition. So that worked out finally very, very well, and where are we then? Well, he got the paintings done, and then he came in the spring of the next year, to have the opening show at the California Academy. And by that time, I knew about this painting and coveted it, of course. And so we got up to the show and got right in the front row before they pulled down the rope or whatever, and went tearing up and said, I want that one. So fortunately, there was somebody else there wanted it very badly. And I think it's a sign of Tony's wonderful ethics. A few days later, he called up and said, you know, there's somebody who would pay you a lot more for this painting than you paid for it. And I said, no way. And he said, well, I had to tell you. I mean, I thought this was just a very, very touching thing. So anyhow, then later on, there was, they had a show, I guess it was at the Smithsonian, and of all of the paintings from that tour, that trip, that journey. And so they asked whether they could borrow the painted lady to have in the show, and we said sure, but with the condition, you have to give us a painting to cover up that big hole. So, Peter, I don't know whether Peter arranged it or who arranged it, but anyhow, we got this wonderful 4 days on the dunes of Death Valley. And about 6 months later, it was time for the painting lady to come back, and we said, we'll buy this one too. Well, okay, then a couple of years later, I got a communication saying, why don't you come to the Grand Canyon? And because I want to do some paintings there. So we said, sure. And this is a relief map of the Grand Canyon. And what we were going to do is first take the top of the North Bass Point to Swamp Point, Bass Trail to Swamp Point, where Tony would do some painting, and then we could do some exploring. And then we're going to go to the Bill Hall Trail, not far away, and go down to that part of the Grand Canyon, which is it's the Tonto platform, I think, in the south, and the Esplanade in the north, which is very flat, and then is joined and separated by the inner canyon. So we got our logistics and all of our food and took off. And this is now camped at Swamp Point, literally right on the edge. And of course, the roads to get there, about 14 miles of some terrible roads. They weren't, I just read a description of the roads, and they say you have to have four-wheel drive. And so anyhow, we found it, and Tony went to work. And you can see there he is, considering what he wants to do and deciding on the way he does do this. He chooses a site and studies it. And then he started painting. Damned if that's not what he painted. Again, this remarkable coincidence. So we have that painting too. I think he's got a good thing going. Well, then here's another picture that I took of Steamboat Mountain. And it's a very prominent thing. And I thought this was fabulous and took a picture of it. And so did Tony. Well, okay, so then remember that we're 14 miles out on a very remote road, and there isn't anybody else around. And I got into the car and decided to do something there, and suddenly realized that, no, it didn't have any power. The battery was dead. So Lucia and I took off to head to the nearest civilization, which was in fact 14 miles. And it was 14 miles of walking on things like that. This is one of the best roads. And I think we've been going a couple of hours, and a pickup truck suddenly appeared in the scene. And the driver got out and said, "Am I lost or are you lost?" So he said, "You just stay right here, I'll be back. I've got something I have to do, but I'll be back within an hour, and I have a long jumper cable, and we'll fix your car." So we got out of that, all right. Well, then we went to the Bill Hall Trail, and we're going to do a real hike. Lucia and I were going to go all the way down to the canyon, and Tony was going to stop on the Esplanade. So this is now getting down to the Esplanade, and you see what I mean by flat. There are also some remarkable rock formations, just sculpted with the wind. I mean, they're extraordinary. This is now one of the little side canyons that goes down to the inner canyon, and we're started down. Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. And this is now what's called the red wall. The red wall really defines the inner canyon. It's harder, and so the Colorado River has not cut such a wide swath. And you'd think that it all looks desperate and desert, but all of a sudden you come to the Tapeats Creek waterfall, where it's just simply coming out of the side of the mountain. And just to show we really did make it there. Okay, but I got fascinated by these. That just looks like a huge rock bug of some sort, just about to eat Lucia. This is tea, regular. And I like these two. I call these the kissing weevils. And there was this crazy rock formation. I thought, that's fascinating. I ought to get a picture of that. Well, so did Tony. I was astonished, really literally astonished in the last couple of weeks as I ran across these things. And there's a meal taking place, and the last tea, I think, or maybe it's a meal. And so that was another wonderful expedition with Tony. Okay, then he called up maybe a year or so later and said he'd like to go across Joshua Tree. And so I said, oh okay, sure. So we got together, did the logistics, and got going. And Joshua Tree has a trail that's part of a major trail or at least it was a major trail, called the California Riding and Hiking Trail. And I'd never heard of it, and turns out a lot of other people hadn't either. But we were going to come in here. Oh, pressing the wrong button. Okay, well, I put in a picture of myself, not because it's anything special, but because, now this time I'm not going to make it go forward. Yeah, that's the ice axe. And he's kidded me mercilessly about the only person he's ever met that has crossed the desert carrying an ice axe. Well, the desert was in bloom. We really hit it at the top. Take this lonely trail for a while, and then you begin to see flowers. This is a typical campsite. And this is a very different country than the Grand Canyon, but also really fascinating. There's Tony at a rest stop. And then the desert in bloom, you can see in the front, out of focus, there are things blooming, things like that. Even the Joshua trees, tidy tips, and of course prickly pear. But I mean, the desert was spectacular. I had never seen the desert bloom before, so this was a rare opportunity. So there he is, there's the master at work. And I was sort of fascinated by that weird shape. And guess what? So was he? Well, we made our way across, and sort of a nice final portrait of Tony, painting again. And I don't know whether that was one of the ones he was working on, a small one. This strange, massive rock, granite, is apparently a rock climber's paradise for people from Los Angeles. And we weren't anywhere near there, but you can imagine that if you like climbing rocks, there's tons of stuff that you can do. And it's world famous. It's not as famous as Yosemite for rock climbing, but it's certainly close to it, at least for the folks in Los Angeles. Oop. We had, it turns out that a road crosses that riding and hiking trail 3 places. So we'd cached water and food and things like that. And this would have been at our last cache. And it worked very well. One problem that Tony had was that the smog would come up the valley. Joshua Tree really has two different deserts. There's the high desert, and then there's a range of mountains. And then it drops down to the Sonoran Desert. It drops quite a lot. So and in that valley, everything would be fine in the morning, but then smoggy stuff would come up from the direction of Los Angeles, and of course make it impossible to paint. So he had to be careful to work early in the morning. He can probably tell you more about that, but it was a little bit depressing. Well, I think you can see the smog down in the valley over there. So it was not perfect conditions. Well, this is our last campsite, and finally we made it out, end of the California hiking and riding trail, and went to see the ranger and report in and say, where do we find the shuttle back to the place we started? And the ranger said, what? And he said, well, where have you been? And so we said, well, we started at the other end, Black Rock, and hiked this section of the trail. And the ranger said, nobody ever does that. Anyhow, we're congratulating ourselves. The congratulations were short-lived when we discovered that it was going to cost us a $70 taxi ride back to the car. Okay, beyond journeys. Those were the one non-journey with Tony, and then 2 with him. We went to his opening in New Mexico, but this time he'd been doing this towards a greater subject, and this is Mount Everest. And we went to that opening, and damn it, we bought that one too. He was apparently ill. He got high altitude sickness and had to get down rapidly. But being determined, he went back up and finished the painting he was working on. I don't recall whether it was this one or not. But anyhow, this is an example of how this guy moves around and how he faces incredible hardship to do something. Well, then he had this I visited him in Tarberdreath sometime in there, and he and his brother Steve and I went for a three-day walk along the coast path, and that was spectacular, except for one thing, and that is that we stayed in inns that we found the 2 nights, and the first night we were all housed in the same room, and apparently I snored fantastically. And and I received a rather chilly reception in the morning, needless to say. Well, on another occasion, he would come here and he would stay with us, and he had stayed several times. And finally he said, you know, your pictures don't, who hung your pictures? And I said, well, I did. And he said, well, what pattern did you follow? I don't see any. And I said, well, random, chaotic, modern. Well, he said, would you mind if I move them around? I thought that was pretty forward. So I went upstairs to work on my computer, and I could hear tap, 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 tap. And all of a sudden, there emerged, and it was, his artist's eye. There are some prints that my grandfather picked up in Prague in 1920, a couple in the middle that are woodblock prints by Toshi Yoshida, a modern Japanese printmaker, and so on. So I forgave him. Yeah. Okay, the next thing, and here's where the ice axe comes in, is Alaska. Back in 1952, I had the ill sense to join an expedition to go climbing in Alaska. And this is Denali, that's Foraker, and that is Carpe. So when Tony had this idea about luminaries, our objective wasn't to climb Denali, but to climb Brooks and Mather, which are a couple of peaks that at that time hadn't been climbed before. The one in the middle is Deception, and we were going to climb that, but it was roaring with avalanche most of the time. And we thought, no, we won't do that. Okay, so this is now halfway up Brooks, and that's Denali. This is an extraordinary mountain. He's standing at about 10,000 feet above sea level, but there's another vertical 2 miles of Denali over us. We've come up about a vertical mile. So it really is a remarkable mountain. Now, this is the ice axe story. And one of the reasons I carried it all the time, I'm not a bit superstitious, but we ran into a slope like this, an icy slope like this on Brooks, and didn't have our crampons on. So I was chopping steps on the way down because I was tired, and Ted Scudder, who was giving me protection from above, said, well, what are you doing? And I said, I don't like these steps, they're too small. So I was going chop, chop, chop. And he said, oh, go on, sit down, I'll stop you. And can you imagine, A, being moronic enough to say that, and B, me being moronic enough to sit down? Well, I took off down the mountain and happened to get a glimpse, and I'd pulled him out. He was coming down too. And eventually, both of us stopped our slide after about 500 feet with our ice axes using a self-arrest. And it took the other rope of 2 another 45 minutes to come down that same 500 feet. So that ice axe goes, I think it's back in here somewhere. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Okay, well then Tony came up with this idea, about luminaries, and I wondered what the hell a luminary was. These were folks that he was going to ask to describe places that they felt merited something special. And of course I thought of Denali. What I thought about luminaries at the time is that they were people who glowed in the dark. And I think there's a quote next to the painting that says something about a swirling torrent of glacial meltwater. And this was the swirling torrent I was talking about. But if you look up, there you see Denali in its splendor. And again, here's Tony painting it. Somebody else took that, not me. And there it is. So I guess I'll conclude here, say that this developed into a lifelong friendship. Save for certain occasional insults. And we'll have one last portrait of him someplace in Joshua Tree. And thank you very much for listening.